probably wondering, why the intense walking? Why the intense music? Well, let me tell you. This is a video of me on my way to class. You may still be wondering, so what? You got out of bed this morning and you didn't sleep through your alarm. Good for you. Yes, I was successful in getting up. But going to class is a big deal because it means I'm getting an education. Education is important to learn, grow, and be successful. But I have learned something recently as well. Education is powerful. This semester, I had the opportunity to read the book Deculturalization and the Struggle for Equality, A Brief History of the Education of Dominated Cultures in the United States. And wow, did this open my eyes as a future educator of the United States, as a student, and just as a citizen of the United States in general. I think I've always kind of taken my education for granted. It's been something that's been expected of me since I went to kindergarten, something I've always done, been a norm in my life, through elementary, middle, high school, and then on to college. So sometimes I do forget how many opportunities I have available to me because of my education. Reading this book, I just saw how education was so desired by everyone that came to the United States and those who weren't given an education, and it really showed me how important education can be. This book also showed me that education is powerful, and sometimes the power of education can be abused. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit later into my critical reaction to this story. I'm also going to further my discussion of Joel Spring's book to include what information was new to me, my reaction to this new information and information I already knew, how I'll use this book as an educator, especially in regards to multicultural education, and how I believe others will respond to this book if they choose to read it. First, I'm going to start off with some information that was new to me from the book. Some of it I had already learned through high school in American history and American literature. I also learned some of this information in an American literature class I took a previous semester in college. However, some was new to me. One main point that carried throughout the whole book was the educational methods for global cultural encounters, which I was not knowledgeable about before reading Joel Spring's book. And these methods, some were positive and some were negative. And I had never really put names and differentiated between these as modes of denying education to a group or a culture. So just starting off with learning about that in the first chapter of Joel Spring's book was really instrumental in my knowledge for the rest of the book. Other new information I learned about was the exclusion and segregation of the Hispanic and Latino Americans. I feel like I've heard about the hardships of Native Americans, African Americans, and even Asian Americans previously in my education, but I've never really focused on the Hispanic and Latino cultures and their struggles when they came to America and were denied an education. There was blatant discrimination against these groups of people, and this really surprised me. For example, in the 1930s, when the U.S. government deported 400,000 Mexican Americans to Mexico due to uncertain nature of their citizenship rights, when these people were actually, most of them were natural-born citizens. So this just shocked me, so that something like this happened not too long ago in the 1930s. It really saddened me for the Mexican Americans to see the children deprived of an education due to their lack of English, because English was the required nature of the school, and that they didn't enforce the compulsory school laws so that Mexican children could work on the land for cheap labor rather than receive an education. And this was just heartbreaking to me that a lot of these children were unable to receive an education because of the blatant discrimination. Another aspect of new information that I learned was the No Child Left Behind Act. I've always grown up hearing about this in the media or my education classes in college, but I've really never gotten to the nitty-gritty of the No Child Left Behind. And reading about this passing and results of the No Child Left Behind Act was really eye-opening and important to me, because I know this is something that is happening in today's world and I'm going to have to face as an educator. As I mentioned before, some topics in Joel Spring's book I have learned before in previous classes, such as Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Movement, how the Native Americans lost their land. However, even for the topics I was familiar with, Spring relayed so many more details and facts about the events, which made it new and exciting to learn about. And every single topic that Joel Spring presented in the book was so well researched and backed up by so many facts and anecdotes. It helped me take in information I was already comfortable with and delve deeper into these topics to think more critically about them. For example, while I was reading about how the Native Americans lost their land to the early American colonists, I tried to put myself into the shoes of the colonists. Would I have adopted that mob mentality that thought the Native Americans were evil and deserved to be kicked off the land? I also thought about put myself in the place of those Native Americans when, for the Trail of Tears, when they were kicked off their land, sometimes their children were taken without their knowledge. And I just can't even imagine the heartbreak for a mother to lose her child like that. So in general, Joel's details about the topics allowed me to really imagine and process the events that took place in the history of the United States on an even deeper level. While I was reading both this old information I discussed and the new information that I learned, my reaction usually included surprise and disbelief. Some of the laws passed in this country that denied education to groups of people and denied these people rights in general was unbelievable. There's a lot of racist comments that Joel kind of shared, the quotes of these racist comments of government officials, and they're really hard to hear because it just shows the negative views of the nation that they had towards human beings who were living here. For example, there was a quote by John Miller in the 1876 California Constitutional Conventions that compared the Chinese people to be the most vile and degraded and the most detestable people to ever afflict the earth, which is so hard to hear that they actually called another human being this. While reading, I also felt appreciative that he wasn't biased at all in his presentation of the information. Later I looked back and saw that he had Native American ancestry, but you wouldn't have known that he had any biases or really felt drawn towards that culture by just reading. He presented all the information as equally as important, but you could still tell he was passionate about the topics, probably because of his ancestry. I was also appreciative that Joel Spring used timelines in each chapter to highlight the most important events and laws passed. This visual really helped me keep track of all the important events being discussed in the chapter and the sequences that they took place in. I mentioned in the beginning that this book really showed me that education is powerful, and sometimes this power can be abused. I think just in general from my discussion of this book already, it's clear that education was not always used for the best purposes in the United States. A lot of times it was used to take away the culture of certain groups, take away their language, tell them they had to become American, had to learn English. And the results on the people that were losing their language and their heritage is so evident, that the hurt they had because of this. And I think this just shows that teachers and educators do have power, and they need to use this power for good so that all students and those affected by education can really thrive and not have something taken from them, like their culture or their identity. So after reading and reflecting on Joel Spring's book, I really think that this is a book that every educator should read because it covers such important topics related to multicultural education and shows that education is powerful and this power should not be abused. I think truly understanding the history of cultural groups that I'll likely be teaching in the future can help me better understand children's viewpoints that come from these cultures. I also think it will help me create a classroom environment that incorporates and welcomes all backgrounds and cultures. I'm no expert on every culture now because I read this book, but I still have more background and see the place these cultures are coming for and the struggles they face due to education in the United States education system. Schools greatly impact society. For example, if schools promote equality and acceptance of everyone, then possibly society will start reflecting this equality. That's why it's so integral that educators read this book and become versed in knowing that in the history there was deculturalization, but we need to work towards multicultural education and equality. Not only educators should read this book, I believe to create truly a society where every culture is valued and every culture receives education at the same level as everyone else, then this book is a necessity for citizens, general citizens of the United States to read. It's not a hard read with short chapters and the visuals of the timeline, so I believe it's a book that anyone has the ability to pick up and read and learn a little bit about the truth about our education system and not just what we always hear what society tells us. Joel speaks the truth in this book, and so I think it is a great book for anyone to read. Overall, I really enjoyed reading this book, learning more about the education system. I hope that I can take what I've learned here in this book and in this class to my future classroom to try to create a culture that accepts everyone's an equal, but also people are recognized for their differences and their cultures are celebrated.